On my son's 28th birthday, while his friends laughed and the night seemed perfect, he raised his beer and shouted, "The best gift you can give me, Dad, is to disappear from my life forever." I smiled. I walked away, and everyone thought I swallowed the humiliation in silence. But by midnight, flashing red and blue lights filled his driveway. And when the police cuffed him, it was because of the phone call I made. Before I tell you how it all happened, don't forget to subscribe and share this story. Because some betrayals cut so deep, only justice can heal them. Brandon was born on a rainy April morning, and for me, he was the sun that cut through the storm. I still remember the way he gripped my finger in the hospital. So tiny, so fragile, and I promised his mother that no matter what, I'd protect him. When she passed away too young, I kept that promise. I worked double shifts, sacrificed weekends, skipped vacations. Also, Brandon would never feel the emptiness of losing her. Birthdays were always special. I never missed one. From dinosaur cakes when he was 5, to baseball tickets when he turned 13, to buying him his first car at 18. Each year, I tried to remind him that he wasn't alone in this world, that he had me, his father. So when I showed up at his house that evening, carrying a homemade chocolate cake in one hand and his grandfather's vintage watch wrapped carefully under my arm, I thought I was bringing him joy. Instead, I walked into a storm I never expected. Through the sliding glass door, I could see him by the grill, surrounded by friends. Laughter rolled out into the night, along with the smell of burgers and beer. For a moment, I just stood there watching him. My boy grown into a man, surrounded by people I barely knew. Then I heard it. "Man, your dad really went all out for this party," one of his friends said. "Sound system, catering, even the premium drinks. You're lucky." But Brandon only smirked, raised his bottle, and replied loud enough for everyone to hear, "He's just trying to buy my affection. Thinks money solves everything." The cake wobbled in my hand. The gift box felt suddenly heavier. And when another friend tried to defend me, Brandon's laugh, cold, sharp, cut through the night. "Honestly," he said, "the best gift my old man could give me is to disappear from my life forever." The words hit harder than any punch I'd ever taken, and that was only the beginning. We pick up where the father has just overheard his son mocking him, and now the betrayal deepens into invisible stakes. I stood there, pressed against the wall of my own son's house, cake trembling in my hands. 28 years of memories, late-night fevers, scraped knees, homework I stayed up to help him with. All of it collapsed into that single moment of cruelty. I slipped away quietly, leaving the laughter behind. No one noticed me, not even Brandon. The cake I had baked with trembling hands ended up on the kitchen counter at home, untouched. The vintage watch, his grandfather's legacy, stayed in its box, unopened. I sat in the silence of my living room, staring at the flicker of the lamp, and the truth echoed in my head. My son wanted me gone, erased, forgotten. But what Brandon didn't know was that while he drank and joked with his friends, I held a truth he thought I had buried forever. A secret that could destroy the life he had built. And for years, I had protected him from it. Because that's what fathers do, shield their children, even from their own mistakes. It began 2 years earlier, when Brandon called me past midnight, his voice trembling. "Dad, please, I messed up." He had been caught in something far darker than a bar fight or unpaid bills. There were drugs, stolen property, friends, who weren't really friends. He begged me to bail him out, to cover the costs, to keep his name off the record. And I did. I paid every cent. I pulled every string. I buried the evidence so deep no one could trace it. But I kept one thing. Just one. A file I told myself I would never use unless I had no choice. That night, when my son told the world he wished I would disappear, something inside me broke. The love remained, but the blind loyalty did not. The turning point approaches. I sat in my armchair, gripping that old manila folder, the one with his name scrawled across the front. My heart pounded as the voices from his birthday echoed in my head. The best gift would be if you disappeared from my life forever. Fine. If my existence was nothing but a burden to him, then I would give him what he asked for. But not the way he expected. At exactly 10:42 p.m., I picked up the phone. My voice was steady as I spoke the words I never thought I would say. "Yes, officer. I have information about Brandon Lewis. You'll want to see this." I hung up, the folder resting on my lap like a loaded gun. And an hour later, the flashing lights painted my front yard red and blue. The night air filled with the barked orders of officers, the metallic click of handcuffs, and my son's voice no longer mocking, no longer proud, but desperate, panicked, and filled with rage. "Dad, what did you do?" And that's where everything truly began to unravel. Because the police weren't just there for a routine arrest. What they discovered that night would tear open wounds none of us were ready for. We left off with Brandon being cuffed in the front yard, the police swarming while he screamed at his father. Now the secret begins to unfold. When they took Brandon away that night, the neighborhood erupted. Porch lights flicked on. Curtains twitched. His friends, who only hours earlier toasted to his birthday, now stood frozen on the lawn, beer bottles dangling in their hands. One of the officers stepped toward me. "Sir, you're the one who made the call?" I nodded. My voice didn't shake, but my knees nearly did. He took the folder from my hands, the same one I'd guarded for 2 years like a cursed treasure. Inside were copies of text messages, receipts, and a witness statement. Evidence that Brandon and his friends had been running more than just parties behind closed doors. Stolen electronics, a hidden stash in the storage unit under his name, and ties to a group already under federal investigation. The officer flipped through the pages, his face hardening. "You did the right thing. But tell me, what father wants to hear those words when it's his own son being led away in chains?" The next morning, I drove to the police station. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly, I thought it might snap. I needed to see him, to explain, to try and salvage something. But when I walked into that gray, soulless room, Brandon's eyes met mine with pure venom. "You did this," he hissed across the table. His wrists were chained, his face pale but burning with rage. "You ruined my life." "No, son," I whispered. "You ruined your own life long ago. I just stopped protecting you from the consequences." He spat the words back at me. "You're dead to me." Those words cut deeper than the birthday insult. Because this time, I knew he meant them. By noon, the story had leaked. Social media lit up with pictures of Brandon being shoved into a squad car. The same friends who laughed with him the night before now shared posts to distance themselves. His job suspended him instantly. His girlfriend packed her bags. And me, I sat alone on my porch, staring at the headlines, wondering if I had destroyed my son's life, or if I had finally saved it. What no one knew, what Brandon himself didn't realize, was that the evidence I handed over wasn't just about him. There was someone else, someone far more dangerous, lurking behind the scenes. The folder contained names of men who wouldn't take kindly to police sniffing around their business. By turning my son in, I hadn't just ended his freedom, I had put a target on his back. And when I saw a black SUV parked across the street later that evening, engine idling, windows tinted too dark to see through, I realized this story was only just beginning, because the law might have my son in custody. But the people he crossed, they weren't bound by law at all. We left off with Brandon in custody, the media in a frenzy, and a black SUV watching the father's house. Now the fallout grows darker. That SUV sat outside my house for 2 hours. Its engine purred like a predator breathing. Every now and then, I'd catch a flicker of movement behind the tinted glass. They weren't neighbors. They weren't police. I knew exactly who they were. The men Brandon had entangled himself with. Men who didn't forgive debts, who didn't tolerate weakness. And by calling the police, I hadn't just betrayed my son. I had betrayed them. At 11:15 p.m., the SUV finally pulled away, but the message was clear. They knew where I lived. The next morning, I forced myself back to the police station. I needed to see Brandon again, not as his accuser, but as his father. When I walked in, he wouldn't look at me. His jaw was set, his fists clenched against the metal table. "You think you saved me, old man?" His voice dripped with contempt. "All you did was sign my death warrant. You don't know these people. They won't stop. Not until I'm gone. And maybe that's what you wanted all along." I swallowed hard. "I wanted you alive, Brandon. even if that meant you hating me." He laughed, sharp, bitter. "You should have disappeared like I asked. That would have been the best gift." I left the station trembling. Every word replayed in my head. For years I had been his shield. I thought exposing him would force him to change. But what if all I had done was hand him to wolves? Back home, the phone rang. A deep voice on the other end, calm but chilling. "You should have kept quiet, Robert. The boy was useful. Now he's a liability. And you're next." Click. I sat in silence, the receiver buzzing in my hand. For the first time, I felt something I hadn't felt since his mother died. Absolute fear. That night, I walked into my garage, opened the old cedar chest, and pulled out a shoebox. Inside were letters Brandon had written me as a child, Father's Day cards scrawled in crayon, a note from middle school saying, "Thanks for teaching me how to be brave." I stared at those words, and the tears finally came, because I realized I wasn't finished. I couldn't just let him rot in jail while men with guns circled like vultures. But to protect him again, I would have to put myself directly in their line of fire. The choice looms. At 2 a.m., I loaded the folder, the shoebox, and the watch meant for his birthday into my car. My chest was heavy, but my mind was clear. If the past 28 years had taught me anything, it was this. A father doesn't stop being a father, even when his child wishes he'd disappear. And I was about to prove it, because if my son was going to survive the storm I had unleashed, I would have to walk straight into it myself. I drove through the sleeping city, headlights cutting across empty streets. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter with every mile. The SUV had followed me before. I knew they would find me again, and I wasn't going to hide. By the docks, I parked beneath a flickering streetlight, the kind of place where whispers traveled faster than bullets. It didn't take long. Tires screeched, doors slammed, and 3 men approached. Leather jackets, cold eyes, movements sharp and precise. One of them leaned into my window. His breath reeked of tobacco. "You're Robert Lewis." Not a question, a statement. "You turned your boy in, and in doing so, you turned him over to us." I forced my voice steady. "He's still my son, and you're not going to touch him." They laughed, cruel and humorless. "Old man, you think a call to the cops makes you powerful? Your boy owes us. That debt doesn't vanish because you waved some papers." Then one of them pulled something from his coat, a photograph. Brandon. Not with his friends, not at his job, but standing beside them, shake hands, smiling. The air in my lungs turned to ice. "He wasn't just some kid dabbling in our business," the man sneered. "He was one of us. He made promises. He took money. He moved goods. He's not innocent. He's a partner." My world tilted. All those nights he'd begged for help. All those calls about needing bail, needing protection. He hadn't been a victim. He had been building his own empire of mistakes. And I had been his silent investor. The rage that rose inside me was unlike anything I had ever felt. For years I had bled myself dry to protect him, believing he was salvageable. Believing the boy I'd raised still lived somewhere inside the man. But the truth was uglier than I could bear. He had lied to me, used me. He hadn't stumbled into trouble. He had invited it. Still, I found my voice. "If you want him, you'll have to go through me first." The leader's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Careful, Robert. We don't need him alive to send a message. And maybe you're the better message." My pulse thundered as they stepped closer. But just then, a flood of light burst over the dock. Sirens wailed. Police cars swarmed. The lot. Officers leapt out, weapons raised. The men scattered like rats into the shadows. I dropped my head against the steering wheel. Relief, crashing into me like a wave. One officer pulled my door open. "Mr. Lewis, are you all right?" I nodded, though my hands were shaking. How? Did you know I'd be here?" He lifted the folder I had given them days earlier. "You gave us everything we needed. Phones were tapped, movements tracked. We've been watching them longer than you realized. You just helped bring the whole network down." As the men were dragged away in handcuffs, one shouted over his shoulder, "Your boy isn't finished. He'll never forgive you." And I knew he was right. Because while the criminals were locked away, Brandon still sat in his cell, burning with hatred for the man who put him there. And the worst part? He still didn't know I had just saved his life again. The battle with the outside world was over, but the real war between father and son was only beginning. We left off with the father saving Brandon from the criminals circling him, but his son still rotting in a cell, convinced his father had only betrayed him. Now comes the confrontation that will break them or heal them. 2 days later, I walked through the cold corridors of the county jail. Each step echoed like a heartbeat, heavy and uncertain. A guard led me into the visiting room. A thick pane of glass divided me from my son. Brandon shuffled in, his orange jumpsuit hanging loose, his eyes ringed with sleeplessness. The boy who once begged me to push him higher on a swing was gone. In his place sat a man with bitterness carved deep into his face. He picked up the phone, didn't say hello, didn't blink, just stared. "Why are you here?" he asked flatly. "To see my son," I said. My voice cracked, despite my best effort. "You mean the son you handed to the police? The son you sold out on his birthday?" I swallowed the ache. "I didn't sell you out, Brandon. I saved you." He laughed, sharp and hollow.
"Save me? You destroyed me. Everyone knows my name now. My friends are gone."
"My job's gone. My life is over. Your friends were never friends. Your job was a lie. And your life? You were handing it away piece by piece to men who would have buried you long before I did." He slammed his hand against the glass. "You don't know anything." "Yes, I do," I snapped, the words ripping out of me like thunder. "I know the photo. I saw it. You weren't their victim, Brandon. You were their partner." His face paled, but his jaw tightened. "So what if I was? At least they respected me. At least they treated me like a man. You," his voice cracked, almost broke, "you just treated me like a disappointment you could throw money at." Silence thickened between us. His words cut, deeper than the glass between us. I whispered, "Everything I did, every dollar, every sleepless night, every sacrifice, was because I loved you. Because I believed you were better than this." Brandon's eyes glistened for the briefest second, but then he looked away. "Love isn't enough, Dad. Not anymore." The guard tapped the clock. Time was up. Brandon hung up the phone, stood, and walked away without another glance. I sat there, frozen, my hand still clutching the receiver. For years, I thought I could endure anything: loneliness, betrayal, sacrifice. But watching my only son walk away like I was a stranger, that was the breaking point. And yet, as I rose to leave, the guard leaned close and whispered, "Your boy's lucky. Those men would have killed him if you hadn't made that call. He may hate you now, but one day he'll understand." I stepped back into the daylight, unsure if that day would ever come. When I picked it up, a voice I hadn't expected spoke on the other end. "Brandon's lawyer. There's something you need to know, Mr. Lewis. Something about your son's case. Something that might change everything." And just like that, the story twisted again. Because sometimes the truth doesn't just hurt. Sometimes it shatters everything you thought you knew. We left off with the lawyer's mysterious phone call, hinting at a revelation that could change everything. Now the truth begins to surface. I sat in his office, the air thick with the scent of stale coffee and paper files. Brandon's lawyer leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "Mr. Lewis, your son isn't the only one under investigation," he said carefully. "The men he got involved with, they were using him. He wasn't just reckless, he was a pawn." My chest tightened. A pawn. He slid a folder across the desk. Inside were surveillance photos, bank transfers, recordings. They funneled stolen goods and money through his accounts. On paper, he looked like the mastermind. But the real players stayed hidden. If Brandon hadn't been arrested when he was, he would have taken the fall for crimes that weren't even his. I leaned back, dizzy. My son wasn't innocent, but he wasn't the monster I'd started to believe either. He was reckless, selfish, arrogant, but he was also trapped in something bigger than himself. The lawyer's voice softened. "If you hadn't made that call, Robert, those men would have burned him alive, legally or literally. You didn't betray your son. You saved him." That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The lawyer's words should have brought relief, But all I could hear was Brandon's voice from the glass booth. "You're dead to me. How do you save someone who wants nothing to do with you? How do you prove love to a son who swears he wants you gone?" 3 nights later, a knock echoed at my door. When I opened it, I nearly collapsed. Brandon stood there, still in his orange jumpsuit, flanked by 2 officers. But his eyes were different, not defiant, not mocking, just tired. "5 minutes, one officer said, stepping aside. Brandon shifted on his feet. His voice was hoarse. "They let me out for a hearing tomorrow. My lawyer said, you did more than turn me in. You stopped them from pinning everything on me." I stayed silent, waiting. He swallowed hard. "Why, Dad? After everything I said, why would you still protect me?" The words rose slowly, heavy but steady. "Because you're my son, and no matter how deep you sink, that won't change. I'd rather have you alive and hating me than buried and gone forever." His eyes glistened, but he quickly looked away. "I don't deserve that." Finally, I stepped closer. None of us deserve the love we're given. That's what makes it real. For the first time in years, Brandon didn't argue. He just stood there, shoulders shaking, as if the weight of his mistakes finally pressed too hard to carry. The officer cleared his throat. Time was up. They led him back toward the waiting car. But just before he got in, Brandon glanced back. And in that glance was something I hadn't seen in years. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But the faintest spark of the boy who once wrote me a crayon note that said, "Thanks for teaching me how to be brave." The story wasn't over. Redemption never comes in one night. But for the first time, I believed it was possible. We left off with Brandon showing the first flicker of his old self, just before being taken back into custody. Now comes the hearing, and the test that will decide whether he walks the path of shame or redemption. The courthouse smelled of old wood and nerves. Rows of strangers filled the benches, some curious, others hungry for gossip. Reporters sat in the back, their pens scratching like insects against paper. I sat alone in the front row. My palms were damp, my chest heavy. Brandon shuffled in, shackled, escorted by guards. The orange jumpsuit hung on, him like a brand of failure, his eyes flicking up once to meet mine before darting away. When the judge entered, the room rose as one. Silence fell so thick it rang in my ears. The prosecutor's voice was sharp, rattling off accusations: theft, fraud, distribution. Each word was another nail in Brandon's coffin. He sat still, jaw tight, his hands clenched on the table. Then the defense attorney stood. Brandon's lawyer, the same man who had shown me the folder days earlier. "Your Honor," he began, "my client is not a saint. He has made grave mistakes, but he is not the architect of this scheme. He was exploited by men older, wealthier, and far more dangerous. We can prove it. One by one, documents, recordings, and photos were displayed. Bank transfers from accounts Brandon never controlled. Messages showing he was ordered, not leading. Surveillance. Tapes of men in suits, men whose faces were now plastered across FBI watch lists. The courtroom shifted. Gasps, whispers. Brandon's eyes widened, as the truth he hadn't even known about himself unfolded before him. The prosecutor objected, tried to dismiss it as deflection, but the evidence was too heavy, too detailed. Finally, the judge leaned forward. "This court acknowledges the defendant may not have been the primary orchestrator. Bail is set with conditions, pending further investigation." The shackles were removed. Brandon stood, rubbing his wrists, but instead of relief, his face burned with shame. The cameras had caught everything: the charges, the evidence, his name tied forever to disgrace. And yet, for the first time, he didn't sneer, he didn't blame. He turned, slowly, and his eyes locked on mine. No words, just a look, a silent acknowledgement that the man he had cursed, the man he had wished would disappear, was the very man who had kept him from disappearing forever. When it was over, I stepped into the daylight, blinking against the flashing cameras. Brandon followed behind with his lawyer. Reporters shouting his name, questions cutting the air. He ignored them all. Instead, he walked up beside me. For a moment. Just a moment. He stood there quietly. No insults, No anger. Just the fragile, heavy silence of a son who finally saw his father clearly, and then, softly enough that only I could hear, he muttered, maybe the best gift wasn't you disappearing. Maybe it was you staying. The words nearly broke me. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But the door to it had opened. We left off with Brandon walking beside his father after court, finally showing a crack in his pride. Now comes the fallout, the world outside those courtroom walls. The cameras followed us down the courthouse steps like vultures circling prey. "Reporters," shouted Brandon's name, microphones thrust toward his face. He kept his head low, eyes fixed on the pavement. When we reached the bottom, his so-called friends were waiting. The same ones who drank his beer, laughed at his jokes, and cheered at his parties. But their faces weren't warm anymore. They were twisted with disgust, or worse, pity.
"Should have known you'd drag us down, man," one muttered. "You always were reckless."
Another shook his head. "Stay away from us. We don't want the cops sniffing around." Brandon stopped in his tracks. I saw his jaw clench, his shoulders stiffen. The same pride that had once fueled his arrogance now burned into humiliation. For the first time, I didn't step in. He needed to feel it. That evening, we drove back to his place. The driveway was empty, the lights inside off. His girlfriend's car was gone. He opened the door and stepped into silence. The balloons from his birthday still sagged against the ceiling, half deflated. The remnants of the party, cups, plates, bottles, littered the counters. But the laughter was gone. Brandon walked through the living room like a stranger in his own life. "She left," he said quietly. No bitterness, no anger, just resignation. I didn't reply. Sometimes silence speaks more than words. Hours later, I found him sitting at the kitchen table, the unopened gift I'd brought still sitting there. The box with his grandfather's watch. He held it in his hands, staring at it. Finally, he whispered, "I don't deserve this." I sat across from him. It was never about deserving, Brandon. It was about remembering where you come from, who you are. His eyes flickered toward me, and for once I saw no mockery there. Just a boy. I'm broken and searching for the man he was meant to be. The next day, word had spread. At the grocery store, people whispered behind their carts. At the gas station, a clerk avoided eye contact. Online, his name was everywhere. Mugshots, articles, speculation. Brandon scrolled through his phone, his face pale. "I'm ruined. Nobody will hire me. Nobody will trust me." I took the phone gently from his hand. "Then you rebuild, brick by brick. That's what men do when they've lost everything. They rebuild." For a long time, he just stared at me. And then, almost reluctantly, he nodded. That night, as we sat in the quiet of his kitchen, headlights flared outside. A car slowed, paused in front of the house, then drove on. Brandon's face went white. "They're not done with me, Dad. Those people, they don't forgive. They'll come back." I felt the truth in his words. And deep inside, I knew the battle for his future wasn't just against his own mistakes. It was against enemies who had no intention of letting him walk away alive. Because redemption isn't just about forgiveness. Sometimes, it's about survival. We left off with headlights lingering outside Brandon's house, a reminder that his past wasn't finished with him. Now father and son must face the shadows that refused to let go. We stayed awake that night, sitting in the dim light of the kitchen, neither of us speaking much. The clock ticked louder than usual, and every set of headlights on the street made Brandon flinch. Finally, he broke the silence. "They're watching me, Dad, waiting, and I don't know what to do." I leaned forward, my voice low. "Then you stand up. You don't hide. You don't run. You face it. But this time, not alone." His eyes met mine, searching for something. Maybe courage. Maybe absolution. I wasn't sure which. 2 days later, it wasn't just headlights. A letter arrived. No return address. No signature. Just 4 words scrawled in black marker. "Yule, pay in blood." Brandon's hand shook as he read it. "This is it. They'll come for me." I took the letter, folded it carefully, and tucked it into my jacket. "Then let them come. We'll be ready." But Brandon wasn't ready. Not yet. That night, I found him on the porch, his head in his hands. I don't know how to fight them, Dad, he muttered. I don't know how to fight anyone. I've spent my whole life taking the easy way out. Money from you, protection from others, shortcuts. And now I'm about to pay the price. For the first time, his pride crumbled. There were no excuses, no mocking laugh, just raw fear. I placed a hand on his shoulder. Fear doesn't make you weak, Brandon. Staying in it does. The only way out is through. It came faster than either of us expected. 3 nights later, the same black SUV rolled up again, this time without pretense. Doors opened. 3 men stepped out, their silhouettes sharp under the streetlight. Brandon froze at the window. "It's them," he whispered. I stood tall, my pulse steady. "Then let's end this." We walked outside together. For the first time in years, side by side, father and son, not enemies, not strangers. The men approached, their eyes cold, their movements deliberate. The leader spoke first. "You think you can just walk away? You owe us." Brandon's voice trembled, but he forced the words out. "I don't owe you anything anymore." The man sneered. "Then maybe your father does." He reached into his jacket. The street fell silent. My heart hammered. This was it. And then, in a voice louder than I'd ever heard from him, Brandon shouted, "No! If you want someone, take me. Leave him out of it." The world seemed to stop. For the first time, my son chose to protect me. The leader laughed, low, cruel. But the sound was cut short by the flash of police lights. Sirens wailed. Officers swarmed, weapons raised. The men cursed, throwing their hands up as they were forced to the ground. Brandon stood frozen, his chest heaving, his fists clenched. Then slowly, his eyes turned to me. And in them, I saw something I thought I'd lost forever. The reflection of the boy, who once looked at me like I was his hero. The threat was over. But the question remained. Could a father and son, broken by betrayal and bound by blood, truly find their way back to each other? We left off with the police taking the men into custody, and Brandon finally stepping forward to protect his father. Now comes the most difficult part, the quiet aftermath, where forgiveness is either found or lost forever. The flashing lights faded behind us as we drove away from the scene. Brandon sat in the passenger seat, silent, staring out the window. His knuckles were white, his breathing uneven, but there was something new in his silence, not bitterness, not rage, just thought. Finally he spoke. His voice was rough, like gravel. "I thought I was saving you, Dad. But when the cops showed up, I realized it was you saving me. Again." I kept my eyes on the road, my throat too tight to answer. Back at his house, we sat at the same kitchen table, where days before he had mocked me. The deflated balloons still hung above us like ghosts of the party that had started this nightmare. Brandon rested his hands on the table. He didn't look at me right away. Instead, he stared at the unopened gift box, the watch from his grandfather. Slowly, he pulled the ribbon loose, opened the lid, and lifted it out. The old brass gleamed under the kitchen light. He traced the curve of the glass with his thumb. "This belonged to him, didn't it?" he asked. I nodded. "He wore it every day. Said it reminded him time is the only thing you can never buy back." Brandon's voice broke, "And I wasted so much of it with you." The words hit harder than any insult ever had. He finally looked at me, his eyes wet. "I'm sorry, Dad. For everything. For the things I said, the way I treated you, the years I pushed you away. I thought I was proving I didn't need you, but all I did was prove I was lost without you." For a long moment, I couldn't speak. My hands trembled as I reached across the table.
He hesitated, then placed his hand
In mine. The same hand I had once held when teaching him to walk, to cross the street, to swing a bat. And just like that, after years of distance and betrayal, we were father and son again. The days that followed weren't easy. Brandon still faced charges. His name was still scarred in the public eye. Employers didn't call back. Old friends avoided him. But he kept showing up, to court hearings, to community service, to therapy sessions his lawyer recommended. And every time he came home, we sat at that kitchen table, talking more than we had in years. One night, as we sat watching the clock on his grandfather's watch tick steadily, he said, "You know, Maybe disappearing wasn't the gift I needed. Maybe the real gift was you staying, even when I didn't deserve it. I smiled faintly, tears burning behind my eyes. That's what fathers do. Son, we stay. Months later, when the judge handed down his final ruling, probation instead of prison, community service instead of bars, Brandon turned to me in the courtroom. He didn't whisper, he didn't hide it. "Thank you, Dad," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. And in that moment, I knew the boy I raised had finally started to become the man he was meant to be. Sometimes, love doesn't look like protection. Sometimes, it looks like letting someone fall hard enough to feel the ground beneath them. But no matter how far they fall, no matter how deep the betrayal, a parent's love is the rope that can still pull them back. So if you've ever doubted whether forgiveness is possible, remember this: time can't be bought back, but it can be redeemed. Don't forget to subscribe, share this story with someone who needs hope, and tell me in the comments, what would you have done if you were in my place?